Most of what people think of as stereotypically medieval is very strongly connected to France. Gothic architecture, chivalry, courtship rituals, and romance literature, even castles and knights. France was an institutional and cultural powerhouse throughout most of the Middle Ages. But when we go back in time 1,000 years, back to the 1020s, we go back to a time before many of these things, before Gothic cathedrals, a time when castles were just starting to be built, and knights were more just mounted retainers and not yet quite considered nobles in their own right. France at the time was also a very divided kingdom, but that doesn't make it any less interesting to learn about. The modern country of France originates from the Kingdom of the Western Franks, or West Frankia, which was one of the divisions of the Carolingian Empire after the death of Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, the first of many Louis if you know anything about French kings. Generally speaking, by the 11th century, historians start referring to the kingdom as France instead of West Frankia, since by this time the rulers of East Francia, more or less Germany, stopped really calling themselves kings of the Franks, connecting themselves instead with the Romans as Holy Roman Emperors, or various tribes within their kingdom, like the Saxons to whom the Ottonian dynasty belonged. Because of this, the term Frank started being connected more and more to those we would today call the French. Keep in mind, though, that this was a gradual process, and there were no official declarations or anything that, okay, from here on out, we're the French and our kingdom is called France. But 11th century France also didn't look exactly like the modern country. And I'm not just talking about the Eiffel Tower and Cannes Film Festival. Large parts of what are today France lay outside of it, like the Kingdom of Burgundy, not to be confused with the Duchy of Burgundy, which was part of France. There were also parts of the 11th century kingdom which are no longer part of France today, like the County of Flanders and Catalonia. Although it's debatable whether Catalonia would even really be considered part of France anymore by this point. Ever since Hugh Capet was unable to send help to the Count of Barcelona in 987 against Muslim incursion, they've basically been completely autonomous from the French kings. Speaking of Hugh Capet, the king of France in the 1020s was his son, Robert II, sometimes called Robert the Pious. Their dynasty, the Capetians, is named after Hugh's nickname, Capet, which might be a reference to the monastic hood or capetium, either literally worn by him or symbolic of the fact that his family were lay abbots to several monasteries, including the Abbey of St. Martin of Tours, meaning that they were in charge of those monasteries and their finances. It might also be in reference to the kappa or cape of St. Martin, which was held at the monastery, which he famously cut in half to share with a cold beggar. By Robert's time, the Capetians were a new dynasty. In fact, they weren't even really established as a dynasty. Hugh Capet had been a rather powerful noble before he was king, holding the title of the Duke of Francia, more or less referring to northern France, the land traditionally called Neustria. He was elected king in 987 after the unexpected death of the last Carolingian king, Louis V, who, like several of his predecessors, had relied on support from Hugh and his father, also named Hugh, to maintain their throne. To make a long story short, Hugh was elected in opposition to the last legitimate Carolingian, Charles of Lower Lorraine, who was considered unfit for the throne. And by that I mean he switched sides in wars so much that he pissed off most of the people who would have supported him, especially Adalbero, the Archbishop of Reims, who almost single-handedly carried Hugh to the throne. Nonetheless, Hugh would spend much of his 9-year reign at war with Charles. Today, we tend to see this as a big shift because the Capetians, either directly or through other male line branches, would continue to rule over France until 1848, with a couple of revolutionary interruptions. But at the time, this wasn't seen as a big deal. There'd been 3 non-Carolingian kings in the past 100 years when, for whatever reason, no Carolingian option was deemed acceptable. And 2 of these kings, the brothers Otto and Robert I, were from the Robertian dynasty, which was Hugh's dynasty. In fact, Robert was his grandfather and Otto his granduncle. The Capetians would hold onto the throne for more than just a couple of generations, in part because they tended to ensure the succession of their sons by having them crowned as junior kings in their own lifetime. In fact, Robert II was crowned in the same year as his father, 987. But another reason was that the throne wasn't nearly as much of a prize as one might think, or as it may have once been, at least not for the other high lords of the kingdom. You may be familiar with the concept of feudalism, often presented as a clean triangle with the king at the top and various social levels below, where the king ultimately held authority over the kingdom through feudal ties of loyalty and submission. This sort of theory of authority was being developed at the time, but there probably wasn't a single point in history when this textbook feudalism was ever a true reality, and this is especially the case in the early 11th century. The reality is that the power of the king at the time was quite limited outside his core domain centered around Paris and Orléans, the ancestor of today's Île-de-France. The rest of the kingdom was ruled by powerful dukes and counts, collectively referred to by historians as princes. The princes were, by and large, independent from the king, and although they formally recognized him, or most of them did anyway, the king had little to no authority within their lands, and they took traditional powers like the right to rule in legal cases around murder, the right to appoint bishops, and the right to certain taxes from the king, claiming to do so based on custom and ancient privilege. For many, paying homage to the king meant more establishing an interpersonal bond, though not necessarily one of loyalty or complete submission. The king was very much one of the princes. A term often used is first amongst equals. Those who joined him in battle were almost always those who had existing alliances with him, acting as they did when they had alliances with each other. Some parts, like Brittany as well as Toulouse, actually most of the south really, hardly ever had anything to do with him. The king also mutually contended with his subjects for control over certain lands. For example, Robert II had fought over the Duchy of Burgundy in a succession war, taking it in 1005 and continuing to oppose resistance until 1016 when he gave it to his son Henri. A less successful conflict was that over the county of Troyes, later known as Champagne, after its count, Stephen, died in 1021. Robert had a claim to Troyes, but so did the Count of Blois, Odo II. Odo had been an ally of Robert's when Robert was married to Odo's mother, Bertha of Burgundy, and Robert helped Odo in conflicts against his rival, the Count of Anjou, Fulk-Nerra. But by now, Robert had divorced Bertha, reluctantly. It was a controversial marriage which wasn't approved by the church, and instead married Constance of Arles, who happened to be Fulk-Nerra's cousin. Anyway, Odo quickly took Troyes, essentially surrounding Robert's lands, which Robert objected to but ultimately accepted. That is, until a conflict emerged between them in 1023, and they would continue to fight on and off for several years. But despite having the support of Fulk-Nerra, Robert never managed to take Troyes away from Odo. Despite all this, it's important to realize that being king didn't mean nothing. The king may not have held full authority over his own kingdom, but he wasn't just a puppet either. The theoretical authority of the king did matter, and people recognized it, even if they didn't always fully respect it in the same way as he expected them to. The king was the only prince to be crowned and anointed with holy oil, and, at least until the time of Robert II, the church recognized him as being divinely supported. In fact, it was often churchmen who wrote about the ideals of loyalty and vassalage, ultimately tying everyone's loyalties to the king. The princes didn't always attend the royal court, but they did do so on occasion, like when Robert had his son Henri crowned as his heir in 1027, an event attended by the powerful Duke William V of Aquitaine. Oh, and fun fact, Henri, the future Henri I, would marry the daughter of Yaroslav the Wise, Anna of Kiev, in 1051. Just thought I'd mention that little connection to a previous video in this series. But getting back to Robert, he also traveled extensively early in his reign and was welcomed and submitted to by many of the princes. It didn't change much about the practical reality of Robert's power over his vassals, but it does show that they still recognize themselves as being part of the kingdom and not completely separate from it, whatever that meant to them. Likewise, the king still occasionally interceded and intervened in conflicts between princes, though this was mostly when he had close ties to one or both of them. But the princes were also not the only ones complicating the reality of feudal bonds. They themselves often didn't have full authority over their own lands and vassals. Local powers of various kinds often disputed the authority of those theoretically above them. Although even saying disputed might not be entirely accurate for the time, since neither party necessarily expected their relationship to each other to follow textbook feudalism. In the South especially, where Roman legal tradition was stronger, the idea that you give someone land in exchange for oaths of loyalty and promises of military support was not very strong. Oaths of loyalty, promises of military support, and grants of land or other benefices were considered separate things, and agreeing to one didn't necessarily entail agreement to all. Land was more often given in exchange for rents than for military service. But even in the north, there were different types of bonds, some in exchange for benefices, but not all. Add to that the complexity of loyalties, people swearing oaths to multiple lords, or even bonds which didn't entail submission so much as mutual loyalty amongst equals. Nonetheless, even in cases where there was a clear theoretical subordination, local powers could have a lot of, local power. And in extreme cases, they could be just as autonomous from the prince as the prince from the king. The Dukes of Burgundy, for example, didn't always have a whole lot of power over the various counts of the towns in their duchy, who largely acted independently from him. But sometimes it wasn't even counts, but castellans, that is, holders of castles. Like I said at the start, this was the very beginning of the age of castles. Most of them were wooden towers on a hill with a palisade, though the first stone keeps were being built around this time as well. Some castellans built their own castles, though most had been granted stewardship over them by someone else. Despite this, the Castellans began to exert their own authority over the local area, and sometimes openly defied the ones they were supposed to serve. The Castellans north of the Seine, for example, holding castles built to defend from the Vikings in generations past, sided with Otto in his wars with King Robert, which I mentioned previously, and Robert was far from the only one who had trouble controlling his castle holders. Many Castellans and other local lords extracted taxes from the local population, which were in theory reserved for the count, duke, or even king. They levied their own armies, extracted tolls, granted lands and rights which some would argue weren't theirs to give, though they often claimed right by custom. They also acted as judges in legal cases, which would have traditionally been overseen by counts and dukes, though they still tended to recognize that cases of the high crimes, murder, arson, and rape, ought to be decided by a higher authority, at least in cases between commoners. Kings and princes were constantly trying to rein in local forces in their domains. The exception to this were the Counts of Flanders and the Dukes of Normandy, who had been fairly successful at keeping their vassals under control. But pretty much every other prince from Brittany to Gothia had to contend with them, and even in Flanders and Normandy, maintaining authority wasn't always easy. But kings, dukes, counts, and castellans weren't, of course, the only people in France. The vast majority of people were peasants, though there were different kinds. On the lower end, you had servi, serfs, who worked the lands of large estates and depended on their lord, who could hold a great amount of power over them, for any legal status. You also sometimes had actual slaves, but slavery wasn't all that common at the time. A little higher up, you had free tenants. These people had no lands of their own, but they had more legal rights than a serf, and they paid for land to cultivate through a percentage of their yields, a fixed rent, or, most commonly at this time, labor, cultivating their lord's unleased lands for a certain number of days a year. There were also free landowning peasants who owned their own lands and only had to pay taxes to their local count, though, as I said, Castellans often usurped this right in the areas of their influence. Many of them only owned small amounts of land, but others could be rather wealthy and occasionally leased parts of their land out to tenants. Free landholding peasants were more common in the south, where Roman legal traditions were more influential, but there were still plenty in the north as well. This group also included landed knightly families, who, as I mentioned at the beginning, weren't really considered nobles at the time, though generally speaking, nobility wasn't as defined as it would be later on. Many of them were manor lords who could have fairly large estates with serfs and tenants, while others held smaller plots which they worked themselves. There were also plenty of unlanded knights who depended on benefices, salaries, or regular gifts from their liege. Monasteries were also important landowners, which had historically been gifted lands by kings or other nobles. Some monasteries were controlled by secular authorities, but By the 11th century, there was a push for them to gain autonomy, most notably the Cluniac monasteries, which had become quite influential, and were supported by both Hugh Capet and Robert II. Some monasteries wound up in a similar position to Castellans in terms of local power and influence. The 11th century in France was also a time of economic growth and prosperity. The clerical writer Raoul Glaber noted that it seemed like every community was building a new church in his day. Estate owners were focused more and more on making their lands productive, and in order to encourage the development of forested areas into agricultural lands, they sometimes offered legal rights and exemptions from certain taxes to peasants willing to establish themselves there. But prosperity wasn't just in the fields, it was also in the towns. Southern France had always been more urban than the north, but this period saw those towns grow and become increasingly important in growing networks of trade. Toulouse, for example, was central to trade coming in from the Mediterranean through Barcelona. This helped make towns important local powers in their own rights, sometimes even independent of the counts or bishops who ruled them. By the end of the 1020s, urban communities were just beginning to organize themselves into communes, in order to have a united force to contend against other local powers. This actually started especially in the north, in Flanders. Flanders was the other part of France with an important urban influence, especially as trade networks developed in the North Sea. Towns like Ghent and Ypres started to grow in wealth and influence as trade flowed through them, and this was encouraged by the Count of Flanders in the 1020s, Baldwin IV, though it would be especially the case under his son Baldwin V, when the famous Flemish cloth industry would really start to take off. So, despite the misfortunes of the kings and even many of the princes, things were on the up for lots of people in France 1,000 years ago, with the biggest winners arguably being the local aristocrats who managed to make the castles over which they were given stewardship essentially become their own personal inheritable possessions. Although not everything was better for everyone, and many commoners were forced to pay lots of new taxes which Castellans came up with, though they weren't completely without options, because sometimes a strong local opposition would give confidence to the Castellans' liege to oppose them and even remove them, especially later on in the century. Robert II died in 1031, and he was succeeded by his son Henry I. Henry and his son Philip I are often considered to be the weakest of the early Capetian kings, and their reigns are seen as the low point of royal power. But by the end of the century, the French kings started to successfully rein in the princes and began a gradual process of centralization. But that's beyond the scope of this video. As always, thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.